You know, you can frighten the ruling class and surprise them about once every 20 years. And Seattle caught the ruling class by surprise. You know, they just didn't expect it, and they fucked up big time. And they kind of expected it, but they didn't expect it. And they lost control, and it all worked. You know, and people think, God, we can do it again and again. We can shut down something like the World Trade Organization. Reminded me a little bit of 1968 in Paris, and people on the left wrote long essays, the spirit of 68 will be with us. Well, the ruling class kind of notices when they fucked up. And they have lots of meetings saying, how did we fuck up? And the National Security Council rings up the head of the FBI and said, you fucked up. And the head of the FBI says to the head of the Red Squad, or the anti-terrorist squad, or whatever they call it, you fucked up. And the guy in the Red Squad rings up the guy in the Northwest, Pacific Northwest, and said, how did you fuck up? And so down the chain of command it goes. And the message is, don't fuck up next time. So we get to Washington, D.C., and by this time they're doing preventive arrests, and they're, you know, confiscating little radio stations. They are doing everything that a fully functioning police state does. They're waiving the conspiracy laws, they're running amok, arresting people, etc., etc. And it gets tougher. Then they get Philadelphia, and the Philadelphia cops are saying, we can do better than the D.C. cops. And then you finally get to L.A., where the police have a notorious and lengthy record of insane violence towards anyone not powerful enough to answer back. And by this time, they're really loaded. My slight sense of it is that demonstrators, you know, courageous as they were, might want to rethink some of their strategies. Because people tend to think, you know, the demonstration, sometimes the demonstration is it. Another demo. But, you know, demonstrations stopped the war in Vietnam. Well, they helped, but what stopped the war in Vietnam was politics, organization. Finally, the demonstration. So you don't want to fetishize demonstrations just by themselves.
Now, before I get all off into the nature of my critique of this and start making comparisons to Merlin the magician and reliance upon alchemy, that if we repeat the same failed experiment long enough, over and over again, eventually that lead will become gold. Before I get all off into that, let me point out a very important word on the cover of the book. It's a two-letter word. I'm not even going to be obscene here. As. It doesn't say pacifism is pathology. It says pacifism as pathology. And I think it's a fairly important distinction to make. There's nothing in pacifism, and yes I am going to conflate this articulation of nonviolent principles with pacifism. It's a little crude, but it'll work for purposes here tonight. Pacifism, and any doctrine that I'm aware of that will withstand scrutiny and is worthy of the name, holds that one shall not inflict violence. It says nothing about one will not absorb it. It says nothing about pacifism is synonymous with avoidance of risk. It says nothing about pacifism is synonymous with avoidance of sacrifice, struggle. There have been pacifists in the tradition of opposition in the United States ever since I was old enough to be aware of it. There was a guy by the name of Norman Morrison who was a practicing Quaker that clear back in 1965, when I was still in high school, went down to the Pentagon to protest what they were setting out to do in Vietnam, introducing maneuver battalions at Da Nang. Poured a can of gasoline over his head, struck a match. Got attention for about 4 days. Now, I absolutely disagree with suicide as a political tactic in almost any instance you can name. I think Norman Morrison was a person with enough talent and enough commitment that he could have had an impact if he had extended his life, but he made that choice. I can disagree with the politic of it. I can disagree with the tactic, but the one thing I cannot do is suggest that Norman Morrison avoided risk, that Norman Morrison avoided sacrifice, that Norman Morrison did not have the courage of his convictions. He most certainly did. And there are others in less extreme, although there are several examples of that sort from the Vietnam period I could pull up. But at a level of struggle and sacrifice in nonviolent terms, you'd have to look at the Berrigans who courted imprisonment. Absolute defiance, didn't stay safe for a moment. And again, I can run down other examples. I can run them down all night if you want. People I've worked with, people I know about. In terms of people I work with, Shara Griffith from Greenpeace, who established a peace camp that physically interposed that group of people between federal marshals and my own group at Yellow Thunder Camp occupation in the early 1980s. And there was substantial risk involved in that, because those guys were coming, and what they had in mind to do was something like Waco. And it worked. Had it just been the Indians, and had it just been the armed struggle, where you had had a bloodbath of one sort or another, probably wouldn't have worked out like Waco, because we were better prepared for what it was that was coming, apparently, than the people were there. We were not housed in a structure that was subject to being torched and everybody inside burned alive. So it would have played out a little bit different, but by virtue of the fact of a bunch of little white kids, and that's really what it came down to in the minds of the marshal, we're not going to drive an armored personnel carrier over the top of a bunch of kids who've got well-connected and affluent parents who might just get us in a bunch of trouble. So it worked. It worked on the basis of incurring the risk. But that's not how it usually works. It's not how it usually works. It works by way of a certain sort of collaboration with the functioning of power, because it's well understood that there are certain lines of activity which are not only condoned by the elites, but are considered necessary to demonstrate that this is a functioning democracy, all evidence to the contrary notwithstanding. Things having to do with expression of political speech, so long as you do it in a way that's approved and accepted, doesn't actually disrupt anything. If you won't do it, they'll come down and ask you to organize it and offer you a grant for the purpose. And that reality goes into the definition of the movement of what actually constitutes violence, if you think about it. Consider Seattle. You all aware of Seattle, the WTO demonstrations that occurred there? Are you aware that the big to-do among the so-called nonviolent folk was that there were a bunch of youngsters running around wearing black masks and such, called themselves, I think, the Black Bloc. Anybody ever heard of them? The Black Bloc was being horribly violent. They were breaking the windows in Starbucks coffee houses. Yeah. And so pristine and pure were the advocates of nonviolence in the face of this that people who could never in their wildest imaginings lift a hand to prevent a police officer from doing a damn thing, linked arms, supplanted the cops, and manhandled the black blockers away from the windows protecting the corporate property. True story. True story. It's on videotape. Battle of Seattle. Get it out and look at these brave guys defending Starbucks from the violence of a broken window when they were ostensibly there to protest the corporate ravage of the third world that was translating into hundreds of thousands and even millions of deaths. And if you can't see the contradiction in that, you're not looking. At two levels. One, the idea that a personal posture can be assumed that precludes the violence of the context. And the context is violent, that's why you're there. So it's by no means, no matter what you do, going to be a nonviolent context. Get used to it. What I'm talking about in the third world is going to go on every minute of every protest. They're supposedly the reasons for the protests. And the cops are wearing those guns in their hips and carrying that chemical mace and that pepper gas, that spray, and those other accoutrements of repression for a reason. You don't make them nonviolent by acquiescing. The violence is systemic and it remains there. Your acquiescence simply perpetuates it. That's at the philosophical level, and at the practical level, the idea that somebody who would not oppose a police officer in the process of beating someone half to death with a riot baton could then manhandle a black blocker away from a window kind of speaks for itself. That contradiction has already been remarked. But then the upshot comes on the websites of the movement to do in the aftermath of Seattle. I have one in particular. I won't name the name of the individual, and I doubt that it was a real name that was posted with it anyway, thanking the Black Bloc a lot. Sarcasm dripping. Thanks a lot, guys, for turning Seattle into a fascist state for the duration of your visit here. So let's see. These guys got off the buses from Eugene or wherever it was they were from, okay? And all of a sudden, the police chief and the mayor, both exhibiting visible shock, horrified that these guys were here, and knowing they had to take drastic measures to prevent the breaking of Starbucks windows, ran out and bought themselves a SWAT team, a couple armored personnel carriers, a whole inventory of tear gas, got everybody trained and equipped and coordinated to get it out there in the street. That all happened in about 28 minutes, and then, comes around somehow or another to the idea, and it's a good old American idea. It's kind of like when H. Rap Brown made reference to violence being American as a cherry pie, So is the notion of blaming the victim. Victims of fascism somehow or another become responsible for the fact of the fascism itself. Damn Jews. Hadn't been for them, Nazis wouldn't have exterminated them all. Maybe you can find a logical defensibility to such propositions, but I can't.
Basically, the idea is that, well, especially in North America, pacifists and nonviolent advocates have had a very defining role and even a censoring role in determining what other people's participation can be in a whole range of social struggles. And that the way that they've affected social struggles has made it very much easier for the state to control those social struggles. That nonviolence plays a function of recuperating social struggles, of taking out their teeth, making them harmless, so that they can just exist in this sort of a cesspool of democratic plurality in which everything is okay, nothing can really be challenged or changed, and ideas, opinions can be expressed infinitely without ever having any real impact, without really translating into action. A lot of times people will justify nonviolence, making the very common sense, very simple and ultimately false argument that violence is the government's strong suit, and it makes no sense to fight the violence of the government with violence of our own. And what they're doing is conflating very, very different activities. They're suggesting that somehow defending yourself against police violence, or destroying commodities, or taking over property, fighting to free prisoners, indigenous people fighting to take over stolen land, things of this nature, somehow has any similarities with governments carpet bombing villages, or using landmines, or police torturing people, or putting someone in prison. That just because by some linguistic coincidence these different things can be described as violence, that somehow there's not only similarities between them, but that they're the same thing, and that one is going to reproduce the other. When in fact, by fighting back, people actually raise the stakes of repression and oppression for the state, and actually make real short-term differences, and I think also have a greater potentiality of ultimately destroying the state and capitalism, and helping us create those worlds that we want. I think it's because the left, to a large extent subconsciously, has as its primary role to make resistance harmless. States have recognized that resistance will never disappear, that struggles will never disappear, and in the past they tried suppressing struggles the first time that they show their heads, if there's any sign of them, and that proved ineffective. So nowadays the way that states rule is by accepting the inevitability of conflict and resistance, and just trying to manage it permanently. And the best way to manage it is to also have people in the resistance who are managing it for you. And that's really the role that nonviolence plays, and it's really encouraged by the media, by various dominant political discourses, that the state is allowed to use violence, but people who are rebelling, people who are angry, people who are trying to attack the system are aggressively isolated, slandered, bad-mouthed, punished if they ever use violent tactics.
From the burned-out shell of an Ottawa bank in a quiet family neighborhood come loud cries of condemnation against the self-proclaimed anarchists who blew it up. If blowing up this bank is advance notice or a way to boost the ranks of a murky anti-globalization movement, it may have backfired.
There's been a wave of criticism coming from even other special interest groups.
On the same website, other activists call the firebombers everything from idiots to domestic terrorists who've crossed the line. Too radical.
The mass of protesters in Canada don't support violent activity to start with, but there will be a minority that sees this as an inspirational message in order to carry out further violent acts.
And so in this way, the state and the media train, especially more professionally minded activists within the resistance, to enforce this code of nonviolence so that they never incur that loss in popularity or that bad press. And this creates a self-policing function that, and people who are the sort of politicians of the movement are more susceptible to it because they're thinking often in terms of their own careers. The revolutionary anti-racist action in the Netherlands. So we're talking about a very bourgeois and democratic society, a wealthy society, and also this was a group that was active in the 80s, so relatively recently, the 80s and the beginning of the 90s, and they participated in a broader movement against Shell Oil Company, specifically demanding divestment from South Africa. So this is part of larger anti-capitalist struggles and anti-racist struggles that had along their path certain goals that they wanted to achieve. Certain things that they were fighting for more immediately, and so this group, Revolutionary Anti-Racist Action, actually carried out a number of bombings and sabotage campaigns against Shell, and were successful in winning that divestment, in forcing Shell to pull out of South Africa by causing them such immense amounts of damage. Also in the context of many other tactics, including informational campaigns and boycotts and protests and all these other things working together had a very strong effect. Advocates of nonviolence, they frequently say that nonviolence works, and the principal examples that they use of that are Gandhi in India and Martin Luther King in the U.S. The problem with that is that this represents this constitutes a really great historical whitewashing, that in fact the resistance in India was incredibly diverse, and Gandhi was a very important figure within that resistance, but the resistance was by no means pacifist in its entirety, that there were a number of armed guerrilla groups, a number of militant struggles, very important riots and other strong clashes which were a part of the struggle for Indian independence. So on the one hand, Gandhi basically got negotiating power from the fact that there were other elements in the struggle which were even more threatening to British dominance. So the British specifically chose to dialogue with Gandhi because he was, perhaps for them, the least threatening of the important elements of resistance. If those other elements had not existed, they simply could have ignored Gandhi.
All throughout history, the way we get things done, the way we make progress, is through violence. There has never been a time in which oppressive systems and oppressive structures have been unable to be overthrown without doing it through violent means. You know, even in peaceful acts, even in acts that seemed peaceful, usually there were violent riots or protests behind it. If you look at something like Mahatma Gandhi, like most of the stuff that had been happening in India that led to India eventually getting liberated was the violent protests, was the violent people who were in India trying to change things, but Gandhi ended up just taking all of the credit for it with his nonviolence, when the thing that actually made the progress was the people being violent, because violence scares people. Violence changes things. Violence is the nature of provocation. If you are to put out ideas out there that make people angry, which disagreements tend to, if you're able to want to change an entire system fundamentally that an opposing force, an opposing group, opposing class, in many cases, want to keep, to uphold, then you are going to have to be violent in order to change that, because you are not going to be able to just magically make them give up what they like, because their system, the capitalist system, is built to further their gain. The entire system is built around the idea of this class is going to benefit the most, and the working class is going to have less and less rights. The reason why the working class has gotten rights over time is because it's a bargaining chip. It's not because politicians care about you or because politicians are controlled by you as a voter. No, it's because they're trying to keep you in their system. If we didn't have things like welfare, if we didn't have things like more affordable health care, then, well, a revolution would have happened a long time ago. When we think about things in this way, especially with, things like the Great Depression, at the Great Depression, there was almost a revolution. Communists were everywhere. The Soviet Union was backing so many different groups, and there could have been a chance of a left-leaning candidate even winning at the time. It was only because FDR, took a more centrist position and tried to take all of these left-wing ideas and apply them to a capitalist ideology that the United States was able to stay afloat and remain capitalist. The bourgeoisie had to make those concessions to continue their own existence. So every time we have this illusion of freedom, every time we believe that the capitalists are giving us a vote, that they're giving us something that is benefiting the working class, it's never true, because it's them trying to continue their own existence. And I mean, of course, some of them are good people, they're just entirely misguided, and at the end of the day, it's still benefiting their class as a whole. And so I think the entire system is built around this. And so in order to get around this, the system must be overthrown. And in order to overthrow a system, you use violence, you use revolution. The fact that the system exists and is able to benefit one class so much over the other, and that has always been the case, and that one class has always controlled it in every aspect, there's no other way to get rid of that system than through violence. You can't just peacefully get rid of a system that was built in and of itself to protect the capitalist class. Like, the system was built to protect the capitalist class and to keep the capitalist class alive. So in order to get rid of that system that benefits them, you need to hang the capitalist class. And it's a small price to pay in order to further humanity's goals, in order to further the goals of the working class, of the majority of people. Like, some people are going to have to die because the majority of people will win. What would you rather have? 1 million people die so you can preserve the lives of 1 billion, or keep those million around and then have billions of people around the world continue to starve, for years and years on end? If we could get rid of capitalism, if we could apply a Marxist ideology to the entire world, it would be much better to have those children in Africa not, be the victims of capitalist imperialism and not be dead from starvation and from a lack of water when there very clearly is food and water, more than enough food and water in the world for everyone. If the economy and if the structure of society was just structured a bit differently, then those people could be fed. We've seen in places like the USSR where the GDP and the standards of living just jumped up dramatically when they went over to communism. Like, this has been the case for a lot of socialist states. And so if every state were to be socialist, if the bourgeoisie were to be hanged within every country, then we could start growing things. We could start making the world a better place for the majority of people. And yes, those people would have to die. Yes, they would have to go away. But that is the smallest price to pay for, the majority of people to do well. And, yes, some of them are good people. Some of the capitalists are good people. But sometimes good people have to die for change. Sometimes people need to be dead in order to make the world a better place. In order to make it a better place for everyone. And I just can't feel anything towards them. Sitting here and trying to think about this, and trying to think about, yes, if all of these capitalists died, if I had personally shot, all of these capitalists in a revolution, I just wouldn't care. Because what's better, a bunch of children starving so these people could gain, or them continuing to live because I feel sad when I kill somebody? No, I'm gonna fucking kill that person. I don't see anything wrong with that. I can't feel any sort of emotions towards somebody who is simply going to continue bringing about a system that is having children starve to death, you know? And so I don't feel any empathy towards them, because in the long term, if you think about things in the grand scheme of things, their deaths would ultimately be a good. Bad people being dead is a good thing. And if your ideas, if your actions are actively keeping normal working people, normal innocent people from having good lives, then you should have your head fucking...
This one we're going to be discussing whether or not revolution can be peaceful. Obviously the answer is no. Because if you study history, okay? If you study class struggle, if you study first you have to understand what a revolution actually is, okay? You have Bernie Sanders and people that align themselves with Sanders type of left populism, talking about a political revolution at the polls. Okay, what a poll is, it is, in the context of American bourgeois phony democracy, it is a safety valve. Okay? It is something that people drive you to so that you do not come to revolutionary conclusions. If you have a party, or a so-called party, or an organization, or an individual who claims that you can go to the polls and vote for a certain candidate, and that this is a revolution, they're playing. They're lying to you. Okay? The history of revolutionary struggle tells us that a revolution is when one class is overthrown by another. And the only way that the capitalist imperialists in the United States, people like Donald Trump, the Koch brothers, whoever the hell runs Goldman Sachs, only way that these people are going to be overthrown, keep in mind that these people are willing to use the most brutal and heinous and terrible violence against anybody that so much as breathes wrong in their direction, okay? These are people who flatten rainforests, who spray freezing water on indigenous comrades at Standing Rock for not wanting their territorial sovereignty violated and not wanting their water poisoned. These are people who will drop a bomb on a black neighborhood in Philadelphia for the hell of it. These are people who do not have any concept of the sanctity of human life. That's just a stock phrase that they use. I mean, how was a state like Israel founded on the ruins of thousands of Palestinian dead, hundreds of destroyed villages? How is something like that going to be overthrown? These people know exactly what they're doing, okay? They aren't not woke. As a matter of fact, if you actually listen to some of their private conversations, they are much, much more woke than the average pacifist liberal is. They know what they're doing. They don't give a shit. And the only way to get rid of people who don't give a shit is to show that you know that they don't give a shit, and you give even less of a shit about their lives. That's what the Chinese realized. That's what the Soviets realized. That's what the Vietnamese people realized. That's what the Filipino and Indian and Peruvian people realized. You cannot sit down at a table and negotiate with these people. I'm sorry. And even if you could, what the fuck would you get out of it? You wouldn't get, if you want true liberation, okay? If you want true ending of these abominable situations that capitalism and imperialism has forced us into. If you want this shit to really be ended, why would you opt to just sit and kick the can down the road every election season? Why would you just like this sort of thing eludes me. It really doesn't, because everything has a class nature. Everything comes from a certain class, and if you study the ideological and philosophical roots of pacifism, of peace for peace's sake, you'll find that this is not working class. This is not proletariat at all. If you go to a working class neighborhood, you see violence every day. Okay, you see gang violence, you see police violence, you see domestic violence. I mean, violence is something that the working class is used to. So, if you have somebody that's in a movement space or that's in a party trying to drag people towards this whole pacifist conception of things, you're probably going to be very correct if you assume that their line or their upbringing or their understanding of things is either ruling class or petty bourgeois, little ruling class. Because these people, they're sheltered. They don't understand where power comes from. If you have a husband that is beating the hell out of his wife or his partner every day, the only way that you resolve that contradiction is to take an axe and chop the bastard's head off. That's or remove him from the situation, okay? When you have an antagonistic contradiction, an antagonistic problem, that's only solved by one element or the other being destroyed or removed, okay? So the contradiction, the problem, the issue between the working class and other oppressed classes and the ruling class, the bourgeoisie, the rich, whatever you want to call them, this is an antagonistic contradiction. You negotiate, like you take a policy of negotiation or talking to with comrades, with friends, or with people who you think could be friends. These are non-antagonistic contradictions. The only way that the proletariat can win out over the bourgeoisie is through violence, through the destruction and suppression of the bourgeoisie, by forcibly dislodging them from state power and setting up our own to suppress them. If you want peace, you have to be willing to fight for it. It's that simple. If you haven't yet come to this realization, you're going to. Or there's no place in history for you.
Okay, let's go back to the meaning of the word revolution. A revolution is a process. Okay, revolution is not an event. It is a process that lasts both before and after the establishment or a situation in which the people who have nothing to lose through a revolution are in a position of state power. Okay, revolution is the act by which one class overthrows and suppresses another. It is not had at the ballot box. It's not had by creating seas of communalism in an ocean of capitalism and imperialism like some of the utopian socialists during the 1800s did. Okay, a revolution is an all-encompassing process. We revolutionize individuals, we revolutionize organizations, we revolutionize societies, we revolutionize everything. Because if everything is not touched totally by the revolution, and if we do not seize power for our class, so protracted people's war is the process by which a revolution is made. It has three stages: strategic defensive, strategic equilibrium, basically when the forces of the state and the forces of the people are in basically a state of equilibrium. And all throughout the process of the protracted People's War, we are building our organizations, we are building our army constantly. We are building dual power in areas that we control, which we call base areas. Okay, you've got different types. You have guerrilla areas in which the People's Army is active, and you have areas that are actually controlled by revolutionary forces, which are called base areas. And our goal in Protracted People's War is to expand these base areas constantly and build the new power in these base areas. In the United States, most of these base areas are probably going to be urban or suburban. So the last stage of Protracted People's War, strategic offensive, which is basically the seizure of power throughout the whole country by the People's Army. So this process, it's not a coup, it's not an insurrection. It is an all-encompassing structure. It is an all-encompassing thing. And when you do this, you cannot come in as a pacifist. You cannot take part in a violent revolution. All revolutions are violent because the class that we seek to overthrow, the class that we rebel against, the class that we make revolution against, is not going to simply allow you to take their shit away. Nowhere ever has a ruling class been dispossessed non-violently. They will make reforms. They will throw little sops. They'll throw little bones at you, and they'll turn some of the more outstanding so-called leaders of non-violent movements into sellouts, or as Maoists call them, compradors, intermediaries between the bourgeoisie and the masses. But that's not a revolution. And if you're afraid of violence, why? Is it some sort of... If you go into proletarian neighborhoods, if you go into proletarian areas, violence is an aspect of daily life there. Okay, I grew up in a lumpen proletarian working class neighborhood in North St. Louis. I also lived in Ferguson for most of my formative years. And if you go into these neighborhoods trying to preach non-violence and all that stuff, of course, on the north side, there are scientists saying we must stop killing each other. That's a call for ending the fratricidal, non-productive, counter-revolutionary gang violence there. But in terms of violence against the oppressor, violence against the police beat the shit out of and kill us every day. Ever since we were brought here as slaves, all that we have known is violence, fear of violence. And we know, as a people, as a black nation in this country, that violence is ultimately what will liberate us. So, if you're a little white college kid that's just getting into Marxism, or if you're a liberal that does not understand what we are up against in the society as a people, I mean, look at what the Proud Boys did in Portland. They started a riot, and they got beat the fuck out. They got driven the fuck out of town like they do everywhere else. But our enemies, the fascists, they understand effectively what it will take to build the sort of society that they want, or to maintain the society that they want to keep. Hitler did not sit around and debate with various segments of weak-ass liberal academia. He beat the fuck out of them. That's how he took power in Germany. Through violence. Fascism is violence. And to beat fascism, you have to be just as, if not more violent than those who wish to wipe all of us off the face of the earth. If we could make revolution without hurting a single person, if the rich would just get off their shit and give it to us because of some moral appeal, oh, that would be fine and fucking dandy. But nowhere in the history of class society has that worked. Violence is a universal law of any revolutionary process. The bourgeoisie got power by chopping the heads off the monarchs. Why did the monarchs go away? Because their order of society was an inhibition on the further development of the bourgeoisie. At this time, during the French Revolution, the bourgeoisie, the merchants, the lawyers, these are the revolutionary classes. Now that they have had hegemony for 2 centuries, their time is up. Just like the time of the King of France was up. And they know it. That's why they're becoming more and more desperate. That's why they're mobilizing fascists. That's why they elected Trump. So you have to get real here. You have to study history. Study your historical materialism and realize what the motor is that drives revolutionary processes. Learn what revolutionary is, because a lot of you don't. It's not a game. It's not a dinner party. It is violence. It's a threat of the use of violence. And it is bloody. But ultimately it's beautiful, because to create the new world, we have to destroy the old. And you cannot destroy by coddling.
Hello, this is the Radical Reviewer, taking a look at Pacifism as Pathology, Reflections on the Role of Armed Struggle in North America, by Ward Churchill, AK Press, 2007. The key idea of this text is that if analyzed critically, modern white American pacifism is ineffective for creating change. The text argues that modern pacifism should be seen as a cop-out, because it claims to want change, yet acts in a way that incurs the least amount of sacrifice or harm as possible to those ends. The text argues that if you take what has been protested against, racism within the U.S., war, poverty, death, starvation, deprivation of people in the third world, and compare that to the mode of protest, carrying a sign peaceably until the police tell you to go home, modern pacifism seems to be a very pathetic attempt at solidarity with those facing oppression. You cannot argue with an abuser. You will always lose. In fact, you've lost once you begin. This point has been made by several thinkers, those who argue for reframing the debate, such as George Lakoff, and those who argue for decolonizing our hearts and minds, such as Ward Churchill. The point is that if you try to argue rationally with someone unwilling to meet you in rational debate, your points can be confused and manipulated by the unquestioned assumptions and false premises of the dominant narrative. As the saying goes, it's hard for a man to understand you when his pay is based on not understanding you. There is not a petition campaign that you can construct that is going to cause the power and the status quo to dissipate. It will not be a painless process. But hey, newsflash, it is not a painless process now. If you feel a relative absence of pain, that is testimony only to your position of privilege within the status structure. It is immoral to claim the moral high ground by clinging to ineffective pacifism while bombs are dropped and people are dying of starvation. Nonviolence is a tactical question, not a strategic one. Essentially, arguing that to use pacifism as a strategy regardless of situation is foolish, but to use it tactically, situation to situation, is smart. If people are rounding up and shooting everyone with a picket sign, then nonviolence seems like a foolish tactic. But if people ordered to shoot protesters are refusing to shoot friends and relatives and are instead standing in solidarity with them, then violence would be a foolish tactic. Chris Hedges has made this distinction when explaining his experiences with armed forces who were willing to kill in Sarajevo and armed forces that were unwilling to kill during the fall of the Berlin Wall. Introduction: Pacifism as Pathology, Revisited, Excavating a Debate with Ward Churchill. In referencing some classes that he taught, Ward explains, the premise underlying my session was that many people on the left demonstrated an irrational aversion to firearms based upon abject ignorance of, and consequently intimidation by, the technology itself. It's a bizarre but thought-provoking claim. Whether or not you use violence, it is important to understand the functions and mechanisms of the various weapons used against you. It is a poor strategy to purposefully not understand the weapons your enemy uses against you. Pacifism as Pathology, Notes on an American Pseudo-Praxis by Ward Churchill. Here, essentially, Ward lays out how modern nonviolent protest has had little to no effect on bringing about change and so needs to be re-examined. This section reminds me of Chris Hedges, who has argued that the state's response to the Occupy movement could have been student loan forgiveness, housing programs, raising the minimum wage, etc., which would have quietly made the movement disappear. But instead, the state responded with widespread violence, thus showing a complete bankruptcy on rational response to pacifist protest.
Why Marxists Oppose Individual Terrorism by Leon Trotsky. Our class enemies are in the habit of complaining about our terrorism. What they mean by this is rather unclear. They would like to label all the activities of the proletariat directed against the class enemy's interests as terrorism. The strike, in their eyes, is the principal method of terrorism. The threat of a strike, the organisation of strike pickets, an economic boycott of a slave-driving boss, a moral boycott of a traitor from our own ranks. All this and much more they call terrorism. If terrorism is understood in this way, as any action inspiring fear in or doing harm to the enemy, then of course the entire class struggle is nothing but terrorism. And the only question remaining is whether the bourgeois politicians have the right to pour out their flood of moral indignation about proletarian terrorism when their entire state apparatus, with its laws, police and army, is nothing but an apparatus for capitalist terror. However, it must be said that when they reproach us with terrorism, they are trying, although not always consciously, to give the word a narrower, less indirect meaning. The damaging of machines by workers, for example, is terrorism in this strict sense of the word. The killing of an employer, a threat to set fire to a factory or a death threat to the owner, an assassination attempt, with revolver in hand against a government minister, all these are terrorist acts in the full and authentic sense. However, anyone who has an idea of the true nature of international social democracy ought to know that it has always opposed this kind of terrorism and does so in the most irreconcilable way. Why? Terrorising with the threat of a strike, or actually conducting a strike, is something only industrial workers can do. The social significance of a strike depends directly upon, first, the size of the enterprise or the branch of industry that it affects, and second, the degree to which the workers taking part in it are organised, disciplined, and ready for action. This is just as true of a political strike as it is for an economic one. It continues to be the method of struggle that flows directly from the productive rule of the proletariat in modern society. Belittles the rule of the masses. In order to develop, the capitalist system needs a parliamentary superstructure. But because it cannot confine the modern proletariat to a political ghetto, it must, sooner or later, allow the workers to participate in parliament. In elections, the mass character of the proletariat and its level of political development, quantities which again are determined by its social role, i.e. above all its productive role, find their expression. As in a strike, so in elections, the method, aim and result of the struggle always depend on the social role and strength of the proletariat as a class. Only the workers can conduct a strike. Artisans ruined by the factory, peasants whose water the factory is poisoning, or lumpen proletarians in search of plunder, can smash machines, set fire to a factory, or murder its owner. Only the conscious and organised working class can send a strong representation into the halls of Parliament to look out for proletarian interests. However, in order to murder a prominent official, you need not have the organised masses behind you. The recipe for explosives is accessible to all, and a Browning can be obtained anywhere. In the first case, there is a social struggle, whose methods and means flow necessarily from the nature of the prevailing social order, and in the second, a purely mechanical reaction identical anywhere, in China as in France, very striking in its outward form, murder, explosions and so forth, but absolutely harmless as far as the social system goes. A strike, even of modest size, has social consequences, strengthening of the workers' self-confidence, growth of the trade union, and not infrequently, even an improvement in productive technology. The murder of a factory owner produces effects of a police nature only, or a change of proprietors devoid of any social significance. Whether a terrorist attempt, even a successful one, throws the ruling class into confusion depends on the concrete political circumstances. In any case, the confusion can only be short-lived. The capitalist state does not base itself on government ministers and cannot be eliminated with them. The classes it serves will always find new people. The mechanism remains intact and continues to function. But the disarray introduced into the ranks of the working masses themselves by a terrorist attempt is much deeper. If it is enough to arm oneself with a pistol in order to achieve one's goal, why the efforts of the class struggle? If a thimbleful of gunpowder and a little chunk of lead is enough to shoot the enemy through the neck, what need is there for a class organisation? If it makes sense to terrify highly placed personages with the roar of explosions, where is the need for the party? Why meetings, mass agitation and elections if one can so easily take aim at the ministerial bench from the gallery of Parliament? In our eyes, individual terror is inadmissible precisely because it belittles the role of the masses in their own consciousness, reconciles them to their powerlessness, and turns their eyes and hopes towards a great avenger and liberator who some day will come and accomplish his mission. The anarchist prophets of the propaganda of the deed can argue all they want about the elevating and stimulating influence of terrorist acts on the masses. Theoretical considerations and political experience prove otherwise. The more effective the terrorist acts, the greater their impact. The more they reduce the interest of the masses in self-organisation and self-education. But the smoke from the confusion clears away, the panic disappears, the successor of the murdered minister makes his appearance, life again settles into the old rut, the wheel of capitalist exploitation turns as before. Only the police repression grows more savage and brazen, and as a result, in place of the kindled hopes and artificially aroused excitement comes disillusionment and apathy. The efforts of reaction to put an end to strikes and to the mass workers' movement in general have always, everywhere, ended in failure. Capitalist society needs an active, mobile and intelligent proletariat. It cannot, therefore, bind the proletariat hand and foot for very long. On the other hand, the anarchist propaganda of the deed has shown every time that the state is much richer in the means of physical destruction and mechanical repression than are the terrorist groups. If that is so, where does it leave the revolution? Is it rendered impossible by this state of affairs? Not at all. For the revolution is not a simple aggregate of mechanical means. The revolution can arise only out of the sharpening of the class struggle, and it can find a guarantee of victory only in the social functions of the proletariat. The mass political strike, the armed insurrection, the conquest of state power, all this is determined by the degree to which production has been developed, the alignment of class forces, the proletariat's social weight, and finally by the social composition of the army, since the armed forces are the factor that in time of revolution determines the fate of state power. Social democracy is realistic enough not to try to avoid the revolution that is developing out of the existing historical conditions. On the contrary, it is moving to meet the revolution with eyes wide open. But, contrary to the anarchists, and in direct struggle against them, social democracy rejects all methods and means that have as their goal to artificially force the development of society and to substitute chemical preparations for the insufficient revolutionary strength of the proletariat. Before it is elevated to the level of a method of political struggle, terrorism makes its appearance in the form of individual acts of revenge. So it was in Russia, the classic land of terrorism. The flogging of political prisoners impelled Vera Zasulich to give expression to the general feeling of indignation by an assassination attempt on General Trepov. Her example was imitated in the circles of the revolutionary intelligentsia, who lacked any mass support. What began as an act of unthinking revenge was developed into an entire system in 1879 to 81. The outbreaks of anarchist assassination in Western Europe and North America always come after some atrocity committed by the government, the shooting of strikers or executions of political opponents. The most important psychological source of terrorism is always the feeling of revenge in search of an outlet. There is no need to belabour the point that social democracy has nothing in common with those bought and paid for moralists who, in response to any terrorist act, make solemn declarations about the absolute value of human life. These are the same people who, on other occasions, in the name of other absolute values, for example the nation's honour or the monarch's prestige, are ready to shove millions of people into the hell of war. Today their national hero is the minister who gives the sacred right of private property, and tomorrow, when the desperate hand of the unemployed workers is clenched into a fist or picks upon a weapon, they will start in with all sorts of nonsense about the inadmissibility of violence in any form. Whatever the eunuchs and Pharisees of morality may say, the feeling of revenge has its rights. It does the working class the greatest moral credit that it does not look with vacant indifference upon what is going on in this best of all possible worlds. Not to extinguish the proletariat's unfulfilled feeling of revenge, but on the contrary, to stir it up again and again, to deepen it, and to direct it against the real causes of all injustice and human baseness. That is the task of the social democracy. If we oppose terrorist acts, it is only because individual revenge does not satisfy us. The account we have to settle with the capitalist system is too great to be presented to some functionary called the minister. To learn to see all the crimes against humanity, all the indignities to which the human body and spirit are subjected, as the twisted outgrowths and expressions of the existing moral system, in order to direct all our energies into a collective struggle against this system, that is the direction in which the burning desire for revenge can find its highest moral satisfaction.
So, I want to talk tonight about Endgame, the book on the reality, and the way, that book really began from a fundamental question of, do you believe that this culture is going to undergo a voluntary transformation to a sane and sustainable way of living? And, I've asked that question of thousands of people, and nobody ever says yes. One guy at one of my talks raised his hand, and everybody looks at him. He said, "Oh, voluntary? No, of course not." And so the next question is, if you don't believe that the culture is going to undergo a voluntary transformation to a sane and sustainable way of living, and you care about the land where you live, what does that mean for your strategy and for your tactics? And the answer is we don't really know. And one of the reasons that we don't know is because we don't really talk about it. And one of the reasons that we don't talk about it is because we're all so busy pretending that we have hope. And that's really what the book is about, is if you don't believe that the culture is going to undergo a voluntary transformation, what do you do? And so I think what I would like to do is go through the premises of that book. And one of the things I've done in Endgame is I put my premises in boldface in the front of the book. And one of the reasons I did that is because one of the first rules of propaganda is if you can slide your premises by people, you've got them. So how can we make the U.S. economy grow? God, good question. Well, okay, some of the premises. A, we want the U.S. economy to grow. B, we want the U.S. economy to exist. C, who the hell's we? And so, like I said, I didn't want to do that. I don't want to slide premises by people. And so the structure of this talk is going to be that I want to go through some of the premises for that book. And the first premise is that industrial civilization is not, and civilization itself, but especially industrial civilization, is not and can never be sustainable. Civilization is not and can never be sustainable. A few years ago, I was riding in a car with a friend of mine we were stuck in traffic, and I was just making conversation, and I said, "So, George, if you could live at any level of technology that you wanted, what would it be?" And George can sometimes kind of be a curmudgeon, and that day was not in a good mood, and he said, "Derek, that's a really stupid question. We can fantasize whatever we want, but the truth is there's only one level of technology that's sustainable, and that's the Stone Age. And we're going to be there again someday, and the only question really is what's going to be left of the world when we get there." It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that any way of living that's based on the use of non-renewable resources won't last. In fact, it takes anybody but a rocket scientist to figure that out. But before we go any further, it's like, okay, that's nice. What's civilization? And, you know, I've been bashing civilization for about 15 years now, and so I figure I'd probably better finally define it. And the definition that I'm using is that civilization is a way of life that's characterized by the growth of cities. And that's defensible both linguistically and historically. Well, that's nice, Derek, but what's a city? And a city, I've defined as a collection of people living in numbers large enough to require the importation of resources. And what that means is the Tolowa, on whose land I now live, were not civilized. They didn't require the importation of resources. They didn't live in cities. They lived in villages, camps, and once again, they didn't require the importation of resources. They would eat salmon and clams and huckleberry and salal and salmon and salmon and salmon and salmon, and then usually through the winter they would eat a lot of salmon. And the Tolowa lived there for 12,500 years if you believe the myths of science. And if you believe the myths of the Tolowa, then they lived there since the beginning of time. And this culture has been there for 180 years, 170 years, and the area is getting pretty trashed. And so two things happen as soon as you require the importation of resources. One of them is that your way of living can never be sustainable, because if you require the importation of resources, it means that you've denuded the landscape of that particular resource, and as your city grows, you'll denude an ever larger area. And denuding the landscape of a resource harms the land base. It's very interesting. You know, I know we've all been told that natural selection is based on competition, and that, you know, it's all just a fierce battle for who can be the meanest and grab the most resources most quickly and exploit the most thoroughly. But short of showing how stupid our discourse is, I can disprove that in one sentence if you give me a couple of semicolons. And that's those creatures who've survived in the long run have survived in the long run. Semicolon. You don't survive in the long run by hyper-exploiting your surroundings. Semicolon. You survive in the long run by actually making your habitat better. What a concept. Okay, so anyway, two things happen as soon as you require the importation of resources. One is that you can never be sustainable, which means we could all become the best little natural capitalists in the world, and it doesn't matter. So long as there's this fundamental system in place, it's not going to be sustainable. And the other thing it means is that your way of life must be based on violence, because if you require the importation of resources, trade will never be sufficiently reliable. Because if you require the importation of resources and the people in the next watershed over aren't going to trade you for it, you're going to take it. Which means we could all become junior bodhisattvas, and it wouldn't matter. The U.S. military would still have to be huge, because how else are they going to get access to our oil that just happens to be under somebody else's land? If they require that oil, they're going to take it. So those two things are really fundamental. Because I've been talking about resources, so I want to go back to what I was saying before about any way of life. Another way to look at all this is any way of life that's based on the use of non-renewable resources also won't last. I mean, it doesn't matter what resource you're talking about. I mean, you would think that if you have a way of life that's based on the use of, I don't know, let's just choose a random example. Oil. You would think that you would start to consider what's going to happen when this non-renewable resource runs out. That, once again, just by definition, any way of life that's based on the use of non-renewable resources won't last. And I would go a step further, and I would say that any way of life that's based on the hyper-exploitation of renewable resources won't last. I got into a big argument with this guy several years ago because he was saying that because I use toilet paper that I am just as culpable for deforestation as the CEO of Weyerhaeuser. And I knew that that was wrong, but I couldn't really articulate why. And he said, go ask a tree. A tree will tell you. So I went out and asked a tree, and the tree said, you're an animal, you consume things, get over it. But then it also gave me the other answer, which is yes, I am culpable, not because I consume the flesh of a tree. I'm culpable because I consume the flesh of a tree without fulfilling my end of the bargain. I'm culpable not because I use toilet paper, but because I don't stop Weyerhaeuser from deforesting. And that's a much more serious culpability than simply consuming. So I'm not culpable because I consume Klamath River salmon. I'm culpable because I consume Klamath River salmon and I don't take out the fucking Iron Gate. Traditional communities do not often voluntarily give up or sell the resources on which their communities are based until their communities have been destroyed. They also do not willingly allow their land bases to be damaged so that other resources, gold, oil, and so on, can be extracted. It follows that those who want the resources will do what they can to destroy traditional communities, as we see. Third premise. Our way of living, industrial civilization, is based on, requires, and will collapse very quickly without persistent and widespread violence. I gave a talk a few years ago in Eugene, and afterwards this guy raised his hand and he said, you know, you talk about how violent this culture is, and I just don't see it. There's no violence in my life. I'm not violent myself. I don't see any violence. And it's significant to this story, by the way, that it was a man who said it, not a woman. And I said, okay, where's your shirt made? And he looked and it was made in Bangladesh. And I said, do we even need to talk about that? He's like, no. I said, okay. And also, I'm just wondering, do you pay rent? He's like, yeah. I said, why? He said, because I don't own? I said, no, what would happen if you didn't pay rent? He said, well, I get evicted. I said, what does that mean? I don't understand. What happens when you get evicted? And he said, well, a sheriff would come to my house, and he would... I said, stop right there. What happens is the sheriff comes to your house, and you say, hey, I was just getting done cooking dinner. Come on in. Have some food. So the sheriff comes in, sits down, and you cook him dinner, and you feed him, and you don't poison him. And then after dinner, you say to him, you know, it's been nice having you here, but your company's not all that pleasant, so I would like for you to leave my home now. What would happen? He said, well, the sheriff would take out his gun, and he'd say, I'm here to evict you. You got to leave because you didn't pay your rent. I said, so the reason you pay rent is because if you don't, some guy is going to come to your house with a gun, and he's going to kick you out of your home. He's like, I guess. And I said, okay, let's try it again. What happens if you're really hungry, and so you go to the grocery store, lots of food there, you know, and you just start eating? What's going to happen? So we're going to call the sheriff, and he's going to come. He's the same guy. He's a real asshole, isn't he? The sheriff's going to come and take you away. So what this means is that in order for you to survive, in order for you to have a place to sleep, a place to be, you have to pay somebody. And in order to eat, you have to pay somebody. That's really weird. And if you don't, somebody with a gun is going to come and do something bad to you. Part of the reason is because a lot of the violence is exported. I was doing a talk in Massachusetts a few years ago, and somebody said to me afterwards, you know, we now are living way more sustainably than they did 100 years ago. And I said, how do you know that? They said, because there's a lot more trees here in Massachusetts than there were 100 years ago. I said, yeah, it's because you're getting all your wood from South America. And so a lot of the violence is simply exported. And then the other part of it is a lot of us don't perceive this violence because we've been so metabolized into the system and we so accept its premises that there's no need to do violence to us because we're standing straight in line. This culture, civilization, this I think might be my favorite premise of the book, is based on a clearly defined and widely accepted, yet often unarticulated hierarchy. Violence done by those higher on the hierarchy to those lower is nearly always transparent, invisible, it's unnoticed. When it is noticed, it's fully rationalized. Violence done by those lower on the hierarchy to those higher is met with, is unthinkable. And when it does happen, it's met with shock, horror, and the fetishization of the victims. The property of those higher on the hierarchy is more valuable than the lives of those below. It is acceptable for those above to increase the amount of property they control, in everyday language to make money, by destroying or taking the lives of those below. This is called production. If those below damage the property of those above may kill or otherwise destroy the lives of those below. This is called justice. This culture is not redeemable. The culture won't undergo any sort of voluntary transformation to a sane and sustainable way of living. If we don't put a halt to it, civilization, this culture, will continue to eviscerate the vast majority of humans and to degrade the planet until it, civilization, and probably the planet, collapses. The effects of this degradation will continue to harm humans and non-humans for a very long time. The longer we wait for civilization to crash, or the longer we wait before we ourselves bring it down, the messier will be the crash, and the worse things will be for those humans and non-humans who live during it and for those who come after. There's going to be people sitting along the banks of the Columbia 50 years from now, and, well, they'll be glowing, for one thing, because of Hanford, and they'll also be starving to death, and they'll be saying, I'm starving to death because you allowed the dams to stand. God damn you. The primary, if not only measure, by which we'll be judged by those who come after is going to be the health of the land base. They're not going to give a shit as to whether we voted Democrat, Republican, Green, Anarchist, didn't vote at all. They're not going to give a shit as to whether we recycled. They're not going to give a shit as to whether we were violent or nonviolent. They're not going to give a shit as to whether we're nice people or not nice people. They're not going to give a shit as to whether we wrote great books or made great films or did great talks or anything else. They're going to care about whether they can breathe the air and drink the water. You know, we can all fantasize whatever we want about some groovy eco-socialist utopia with free love everywhere. It doesn't fucking matter if you can't breathe the air and can't drink the water. And the only measure, I mean, it's embarrassing to say this, but the only measure by which any generation will be judged is the health of the land base that they pass on. The needs of the natural world are more important than the needs of the economic system. I have just guaranteed I will never hold public office. Any economic or social system that doesn't benefit the natural communities on which it's based is unsustainable, immoral, and really stupid. Sustainability, morality, and intelligence, as well as justice, requires the dismantling of any such economic or social system, or at the very least disallowing it from damaging your land base. It's like you have not lived until you've been chased down the street by a bunch of pacifists. Because if you mention that there are more humans on the planet than the planet can support, then people suddenly start to presume that you're actually anti-human. The ninth premise is basically, although there will clearly someday be far fewer humans than there are at present, there are many ways this reduction in population could occur. Some of those ways would be characterized by extreme violence and privation. Nuclear Armageddon, for example, would certainly reduce both population and consumption, yet would do so horrifically. The same would be true for a continuation of overshoot followed by crash. Other ways would be characterized by less violence. You know, and I don't know what is going to happen, obviously, but this much I do know, that if we don't approach these problems actively, if we don't talk about our predicament and what we're going to do about it, the violence will be almost undoubtedly be more severe, the privation more extreme. I need to say, by the way, that I don't think that population is actually, yes, there are more humans than the planet can support, but I don't think that population is a primary problem. I think population is actually a tertiary problem. The reason I think population is secondary instead of primary is that I think consumption is way more important, because when, I mean, actual numbers don't matter. There could be 100 gazillion people on the planet, and if they didn't eat, shit, or stand anywhere, it wouldn't matter. The important thing is how much damage you're causing or how much help you're doing. Imagine that also, that humans can actually benefit their land base. What a strange concept that is. And that's really important because when I think about overpopulation, the first image that comes to mind is, honestly, is a little brown baby with a distended belly in a third world nation. First image that comes to mind. When I think of overconsumption, the first thing I think of is an American. And who causes more damage? So that's why I don't think the population is a primary problem, but a secondary problem. And the reason I don't think the population is a secondary problem, but is actually a tertiary problem, is because, once again, the Tolowa lived there for 12,500 years in relatively steady state. And part of the reason is because they had an intimate relationship with their land base, and they would perceive damage to the land base as damage. And if perhaps they start to have too many babies, well, let's cut back. And, I mean, you would think, I mean, let's just think about this. What happens if you have a culture where somebody writes a book, and in this book they tell people to go forth and multiply, and this book becomes a really big bestseller? That's going to affect family planning decisions. You know, the whole thing about making a wall down in Mexico or down at the border of Mexico, and how we need to stop all those Mexicans from coming up and the Central Americans and the El Guatemalans and the Nicaraguans or whatever their names are. I am actually strongly in favor of closing the border to Mexico on one condition, which is that if you close it to people, you close it to the movement of resources as well. depriving the rich of the ability to steal from the poor, and depriving the powerful of the ability to destroy the world. Just like any good abusive situation, we have been made dependent upon the very system that's exploiting us. Part of the reason that we don't fight back more is because if your experience is that your water comes from a tap and that your food comes from a grocery store, not your head, not your heart, but your experience, if that's your experience, you will fight to the death to defend that system that brings you your food and water, because your life depends on it. If your experience is that your water comes from a river and that your food comes from a land base, you will fight to the death to defend that, because your life depends on it. But we have all been so made dependent on this system. This whole we thing, you know, we're bringing freedom and democracy to Iraq, is just so weird, because one of the things I think we really need to do is break that identification with the system and with those in power. There are former granaries of India that are now exporting dog food and tulips to Europe. So there are people who are starving to death right now because where they used to get their food is now making cash crops. And of course this happens the world over. So it depends who we're talking about. You know, it's like the indigenous people, the traditional indigenous people around the world will be better off immediately. The subsistence farmers, better off immediately. The landless being forced off their land, better off immediately. Rural poor, the world over, better off immediately. Well, in one sense, they would be in really bad, and of course in the long run they'd be better off because the system that's exploiting them would be gone, but in the short run they'd be really, really bad because the food is coming in to the city. But on the other hand, you want to talk about instant land reform? Remove U.S. support for the governing people immediately, and you got instantaneous land reform. So, I don't know. And then there's also the urban rich, but fuck them, they're the problem in the first place. Once again, 90% of the water is used for agriculture and industry, so people are not running out of water. Water is being stolen from them. You know, what do you do with the fact that no matter what you do, you're involved in mass murder? You know, because if you're civilized, if you're part of this system already, your hands are blood red. It's just you don't notice it usually. Every action within the industrial economy is harmful, which is really fucked up too. I mean, that's another thing that that's been stolen from us, is the ability to have a fine meal without it being destructive. The ability to simply live without knowing that you're destroying things by your actions. What do you do with the fact that no matter what you do, you're involved in mass murder? And for now, I've got an answer. The civilization is going to come down anyway. You need to start preparing people for the crash.
It's now or it's never, and I've got to make my decision. This time it could be my moment. Is this a mirage or a chance to fulfill my mission? I'm living in a dry land. The land is in a lost end. A heartbeat for demon. Our wages in a change land. I'm given the balance, but I'm standing on razor's edge now. What quick, all my life is over. One strike just offend them, I'm out of his field of vision. Don't ask why I'm ready, but I'm ready to strike him down now. I just saw the new stars, there's no time for it.